Thank you, Julie. It's great to be back with my Jewish learning. This has been a real silver lining of the last year, teaching these classes. A year ago, my daughters, who were in their 30s, said, Mommy, why don't you do some teaching? And I hadn't done any Zoom teaching, obviously, before that, but it's really been fun to put together this sort of 36-year experience and body of knowledge into these classes. And while some people might say, why are you sharing all your secrets? I really feel like this is the time for sharing. And so for this class, I have put together 36 years of experience of making huppot. And I'm telling you how I make all the huppot that I make, ideas for how everybody can make a huppah. Not just for a wedding, you could do it for an anniversary party, you can do it as gifts for friends and family. And I really want to hear your questions because I might skip over some parts that interest certain people, and feel free to put the questions in the chat. Julie will help me draw those to my attention. And as Julie mentioned, I made a page on my website with all of the links to the artists that I'm going to feature and the resources that I mention. So if I don't mention something, look at that page on the website or tell me the question in the chat. So without further ado, oh, and by the way, hello to some old friends from Florida and some extended family, and to all the people I've worked with before. It's really great to see familiar faces on these in these classes. It's really fun. So without further ado, let me share my screen, and hopefully, there we go. Is that good, Julie? Are we good? Okay, great. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about everything you wanted to know about huppot. Huppot is the plural of huppah, by the way, and how to make a huppah. So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how you make one throughout the class, but I'm also going to show you all different ways of making a huppah. First of all, let's discuss what the huppah represents. The huppah, as you know, is used at a Jewish wedding, and it represents the Jewish home that the couple is creating at their wedding. It is a garment in that the traditional huppah is sometimes a talit, and it harkens back to the time when Abraham in the Torah would welcome guests into the tent. So the first brides and grooms were married inside a bridal tent, and then that became translated into a simple canopy, the huppah. And the huppah also represents God's presence at the wedding, that God is hovering above the couple, above their huppah. What is a huppah, and what are the restrictions on what a huppah can be? The huppah is supposed to be a temporary handmade structure. It is not meant to be something that is permanent. It can have a lot of flowers on it, but a traditional huppah is not supposed to be only flowers. So a traditional huppah can have many, many flowers, but you will still have a fabric huppah to symbolize the huppah itself. And then there are no restrictions on the size, the shape, or the decoration of a huppah. Even in the most traditional wedding, it can be almost anything you want. In a traditional wedding, you will see 4 poles being held by 4 people, people important to the couple getting married. But it can be also a structure that is in place, with some kind of support. This wedding that you see in the photograph here, dear friends of our son got married. They are quite observant in Jerusalem, and you can see it is not being held by 4 people. So it's very open about what a huppah can be. So unlike a lot of other things in Judaism, there are not a lot of rules attached to what a huppah can be. This is my huppah from 1984 when my husband and I got married in my parents' backyard in Florida. It was featured in the local paper because it wasn't common to see a huppah like this in Palm Beach. So they put it in the local paper. So I have this picture of it. Our chuppah was very traditional. It was a talit. It was my husband's talit. I gave it to him as a wedding gift, and we put it on top of these PVC poles and put some floral leaves around it. And this was our chuppah. Here's a little bit of a detail. And then when my brother got married to his wonderful wife a few years later, they had a very different kind of chuppah. This is in New York City with lots and lots of peonies, still one of my favorite chuppot because of all these beautiful, beautiful flowers. So you can see that there's a lot of range of what a chuppah can be. The idea of this simple 4 poles with a portable canopy probably, as Anita Diamant says in The Jewish Wedding, started in 16th century Poland. At least we can trace it back to that, as it is represented in this folk painting in 1992. And this is what we've come to think of as a traditional chuppah. So today, a traditional chuppah can be woven by an artist like my friend Lori Kimmelsteele. So her beautiful, beautiful weaving is made into a talit that the bride or groom will have after the wedding and is used as their chuppah. So here are a few examples of Lori's beautiful, beautiful, immaculate weaving. One additional symbol of the talit being used for a chuppah comes from gematria. Gematria is the numerical system where each Hebrew letter has a number attached to it. So the tzitzit, there are 32 little bunches of tzitzit divided across the 4 tzitzit, and 32 corresponds to the Hebrew word for heart, which is lev. Again, another way that the talit is a perfect symbol for hanging over the couple when they get married. Another detail from Lori's beautiful weaving. You don't have to have a hand woven talit to use at a wedding. You can use a purchased talit. This is a very simple, beautiful way to have a chuppah. Now, one popular technique, or several popular techniques for huppot, are applique and embroidery. So I want to talk a little bit about examples of these being used for huppot. My friend Betty Norman makes these beautiful huppot, and it's a very kind of a simple idea. She takes strips of fabric, I believe these are silks, and she weaves them in long strips. I love the effect this gives, this billowy, bright colored effect. And then Betty paints the words from quotations from the wedding ceremony around the border of the chuppah. Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Or kol sason v'kol simcha, the voice of the bride, the voice of the groom, the voice of happiness, the voice of joy. Those are the kinds of quotations you'll see a lot on huppot, and especially today. So I love this look that Betty has done. Again, all the artists I talk about, there are links on the site that you will find in the chat. Here's another example of Betty's beautiful work of taking pieces or strips of fabric and making it look like weaving. I love the idea, and I also love how she uses the organza fabrics on the edges to give that light and airy effect. I'll talk about the poles in just a few minutes, but this is a beautiful setup. Probably, I haven't asked Betty, but probably by a florist. These poles are really nice and sturdy. Now I want to talk briefly about this work by Pamela Fields. Pamela is the sister of a friend of mine, and Pamela made this chuppah for her niece in 2016. I love everything about this chuppah. Pamela made it an abstract design, and there's a secret to it, which I'll tell you about in a minute, but I love the colors. I love how it fit into the nature setting of that particular wedding. It was held at a nature preserve outside Washington, D.C., and it really worked well with the setting. What Pamela did, which is, so this is a beautiful picture underneath. This is Traditional applique. It is not, I don't believe, quilted. It's just pieced, made out of various colors and textures of silks. Pamela has an affinity for Japanese art, so you can see that reflected in this. But here's the surprise. She made this out of 4 different pieces of art that after the wedding are meant to be divided and given as gifts for the bride and groom. So the abstract designs separate into 4 different gifts: a challah cover for Shabbat, a challah cover for the Chagim, for holidays, a matzah cover, and a Baruchim Habayim, which is like a welcome to our home wall hanging. I think this is just brilliant, and I haven't seen this before. So it goes from being a huppah to being 4 different pieces of art that the young couple can use every week in their house. I think that is really, really smart. A lot of the huppot that I make become wall hangings, but I think this is even more clever. So kudos to Pamela. Again, her link is in the chat. And then my friend Heather Stoltz makes applique huppot, and she works with the couple to talk about their interests and what they would like in a huppah. And her work is beautiful and very, very personal to the couple getting married. Here are some examples of her work. I believe she uses mostly cottons and other kinds of fabric and some silk. Now, my friend Anita Small, who I met when I made Torah covers for her synagogue in Toronto, asked me to help her when she wanted to make a huppah for her son who was getting married. So she asked me to draw the drawing, and then she interpreted it into fabric. So all the fabrication is by Anita. This is a photo of the finished huppah. And this is how we work together. So she told me what flowers she would want. We talked about the size. We went back and forth a lot about the details. And then I drew a full-scale drawing. And because she's in Toronto, I just sent her the PDFs, which she printed out full size. And then she took those drawings and found all the fabrics, did the beautiful applique work, and did all that herself. And I think it's just magnificent how she used, in this case, she used ultra suede, which is one of my favorite fabrics. And she used small quantities of ultra suede in several different colors to make this beautiful applique huppah for her son. After the wedding, really cleverly, she quilted it. And because ultra suede is washable, as was the cotton background that she used, it can be used as a bed quilt. So I think that's a brilliant use of a huppah during the wedding and after the wedding. Anita's working on another huppah in the same process for dear friends of hers who are getting married in Israel this summer. Some people take a cherished item and they interpret that into a huppah. And this is a very clever, cool way to repurpose, especially old wedding dresses. So Amy Lassman is a very talented artist and embroiderer. So these are examples of a wedding that the huppah was made out of old wedding dresses from the bride's mother's dresses. Here you can see a detail of it. So Amy will take the dress or pieces of the dress and put those together into a huppah, which is personalized for that wedding. She also does beautiful embroidery. So here are examples of old fabrics that are repurposed for a huppah. I love this idea, and I think it has so much sentimental value for the family that's using the huppah. I've done the same idea where I've taken a wedding dress and cut it up, of course, with the permission of the people getting married who gave it to me. And in this case, I used all the lace flowers as highlights in the huppah. And that was a way of putting their old dress into the huppah. Here's a detail of that. I think it's a fabulous idea, and I love repurposing fabrics. Now, Family trees are a wonderful idea for a chuppah. This is a huppah I made where photographs of the parents of each, the bride and the groom, and the grandparents were in the huppah itself. I'll talk about how I did that in a few minutes, but I think this idea of including a family tree as a huppah is wonderful. And then it can be used for all the cousins who come from the same grandparents. Lovely, lovely idea. And it can be used as a wall hanging after the wedding. This is a detail of that family tree huppah. My friends Rob and Amy, when they got married in 2001, Amy's mother, Susan, hand embroidered a family tree on a very simple white fabric. I love this because it is simple but hard work and beautiful, and is something for the ages because it will be handed down from generation to generation with all these details on it about the family, and so this is just a fabulous idea if you are an embroiderer. Here's a detail of it. That's a lot of embroidery. And Judith Joseph, a very talented artist in Chicago who specializes in ketubot, huppot, painting, and many other things, made this beautiful family tree huppah. And you can see that she used silk, and I don't know if the main fabric was cotton or silk, but you can see this combination of fabrics and, of course, all the details about the family in it. So painting on fabric is a wide-ranging technique that you can do to get the look for many different kinds of huppot. Judith Joseph, who I just mentioned from Chicago, made this beautiful starry night look for a huppah, and I love this. I think it's spectacular. Here's an example of one being used at a wedding. It's just stunning. And this is using fabric paints on fabric. You can do silk, you can do cotton. It really depends on what fabric you want to work with. Hannah Cromer is an old friend of mine who lives and works in Jerusalem. And I love these pictures because they just say Israel and the kind of wedding you see in Israel. And the huppot are beautiful. Hannah specializes in silk screening on silk. And these are gorgeous huppot, which speak to each family's interests or symbols of the families, and have a real Israeli feel, which I think is just stunning. Hannah has a website which is beautiful, and she specializes in painting and painting on fabric. I love this. The idea that all these letters are going up to God, and there's a midrash about that, and look at the setting. I mean, could it be more gorgeous than that? Silk painting is something that I've specialized in for many, many years. So let me just take you through a little bit of how I do it. This huppah that I made for the Vanderwald family in Maryland years and years ago, I understand is being used across all the cousins and nieces and nephews. And it was made by stretching silk and using something called the Surti technique, which is using resist to get the encapsulated color that you see of the flowers and the letters. Oops, sorry. Here's another example of silk painting that I then quilt. This is a beautiful wedding of Cantor next to the water. I love the setting here also. And here's a detail of their huppah. The way I do the silk painting in this case is I stretch the silk, and then I trace the design that I've drawn on paper through, I see it through the silk, and I trace it on with either a pencil or with a disappearing pen. And then I outline the design using Gouda. Gouda is a resist. Now, there are different kinds of Gouda. You can get a kind that can only be dry cleaned, which I don't use anymore. And the kind I use now is called Resistad, and it's water soluble. So it makes a big difference for the environment. It's also easier to use. You don't need special solvents. And you can color it. So you can buy resistad in a neutral color, and then you can add dye to it and make the outlines any color you want, which is really cool. So this is how you apply the resistad using this tip in a little bottle. Again, the resources are in the chat in the place I buy all my supplies from. After the resist dries, you paint in the flowers, and you're kind of doing like a coloring book, and with a little bit of watercolor technique, and you just carefully paint inside the lines. And when all that is dried and has set for about 48 hours, you steam it in a steamer. Now, there are ways to get around steaming the silk depending on the dye that you use, but I use dyes that require steaming. It brings out the vibrancy of the dye and it sets them permanently. So in theory, they could be washed. I mean, you do have to rinse the silk, but it makes them permanent. So after the silk is steamed, then I quilt the entire huppah, usually in one piece. And I use a lot of free motion quilting. For people who are quilters out there, it's all about free motion quilting. I don't do any patterns in mine. Other people do, but I don't. So this is examples of free motion quilting, where you're literally just moving the quilt or the huppah in a free way, and you have to do it steadily so that it looks even. Here's an example of a free motion quilted huppah that was first a silk painting. And another example. This is an example of one of the first huppahs I made, which was made in sections because silk only comes so wide. And so I was constrained and had to add sections of dyed fabric to make it larger and larger. This would become a huppah that would be used by a family and passed around. So they wanted it to be large enough that it could be used for whatever size wedding or huppah that each couple wanted. A lot of people ask about needlepointing huppot. My experience and my recommendation is that the front panel of a huppah can be needlepointed. But if you try to needlepoint the entire huppah, it becomes very, very heavy. You can make a permanent, a stretch frame, a rectangle that you could use for a wedding if you wanted to needlepoint the entire huppah, but just be warned that it is quite heavy with all the wool on it. So what I do is design panels that people put on the front of the huppah, and then the rest of the huppah can be of a lighter technique. So this example was made by my friend Jill Siegel. Her family and she commissioned an entire huppah that Jill wanted to needlepoint the panels around the four sides. I think she finished the first, the front panel, and the three other sides remain. Unfortunately, Jill died after this front panel was finished. And it is a beautiful legacy that she's left for this family. So this was used for her niece's wedding about 2 years ago. And you can see the needlepoint on the front. And then underneath, it's attached to a different kind of huppah that I make, which is a paper cut, which we'll get to in just a minute. Here's another view of the huppah with the needlepoint on the front and the paper cut style huppah underneath. So the way I do this is I design the canvas, and again, the link is in the chat, and I have these canvases that I sell through a needlepoint company. This is what it looks like when you get the canvas. Then it's up to you, the needlepointer, to interpret it in needlepoint. So Jill was an exceptional needlepointer, and you can see this beautiful stitching she did. Here's a detail of it. She put in so many beautiful techniques, and it's just an exquisite work of art. Again, this is the front panel of the huppah. Now, the paper cut style. So when my daughter got married 9 years ago, I wanted to try something new, especially for her and her husband, Michael. So I developed this style. I call it paper cutting style because that's what it comes from, my love of paper cuts, but it's all made of fabric. So I make a paper cut out of ultra suede, and then I sew that onto a sheer fabric, semi-sheer, that I'm hoping will disappear, the backing fabric, and that all the light from it, whether it's an outdoor ceremony or an indoor ceremony like this was, will come through the chuppah. Since making this chuppah about 9 years ago, I've made a lot of them. And I'm going to talk to you about how I do them. So this is Sarah and Mike in front of their chuppah in our synagogue. And then the same chuppah is now a family heirloom in our family. So when my niece got married a few months ago during COVID in a tiny little ceremony in Florida, she used it and embellished it with flowers, which is spectacular. And I love that she personalized it for her. And so now this chuppah, God willing, will be used for all the family weddings. And I love it because it is washable, though we're not washing it, but it did rain after her ceremony, and it was fine in the rain because it's made of ultra suede. And then it doesn't wrinkle, which is the other thing, and it folds up really small and light, so it's great. This is the frame that her florist, my niece's florist, put the chuppah on, which was wonderful. This is another example of the same technique. It's hung on the front of a white background, so you can't see how sheer it is. But this couple asked for a scene that they love in Central Park, like a pathway, and that would be covered with roses. So it's the same idea, a paper cutting of ultra suede on a sheer background. And then this couple, same idea, same technique. He had come from China, the groom. And so the words kol sason v'kol simcha, the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, are translated into Chinese on the chuppah. So you can see the Chinese letters down toward the bottom. Same technique, paper cutting, ultra suede on a sheer background. Here's a detail of that. How do I make these huppot? So I'm going to take you through the process of how I do it and share all the secrets. So the first thing I do is I design the design. I use a combination of old-fashioned pencil and paper, and then I scan it into my computer, and I do a lot of the work in Illustrator. An Adobe Illustrator. I taught myself Illustrator years ago because it's great for repeated patterns and for getting things exactly to be a certain size, as opposed to hand drawing. So I use the combination of the two, and then I blow up the design to full size. This is a full size using printouts that I get at Staples, and I tape them together so that I get a full size. No one printer can do this big a print, but you can get 36 by 48 prints and you put them together so you get a full size. I use this full size print on Xerox paper, and I trace it onto a material called Wonder Under. Wonder Under is a wonder. It's called Fusible Web. Wonder Under is the brand. Fusible Web allows you to, you iron it onto the fabric that you're going to be using, in this case, ultra suede. And I have the design on it already before I iron it on. And then I cut the ultra suede just with an X-Acto knife, just like I'm doing with paper cutting. But the Wonder Under will make the fabric fusible with an iron so that it will stay in place long enough to sew it. So after it's fused onto the ultra suede, I cut out the design using an X-Acto knife, and of course a self-healing mat under it. This takes a lot of time, and it does hurt your hands, so I have to do it, I mean, because of the stress of it, because you're cutting through ultra suede and paper. So it takes time. And also ultra suede doesn't come as wide as I need it to come, so I cut it in pieces. But when you piece the ultra suede together later, you really can't see the seaming. It's pretty invisible. So after this has all been cut, I iron it on to the backing fabric, and I have to use my floor because you can see it's such a large huppah. This one for my daughter was 82 inches square, which is very large. You don't have to do that, but it's my daughter. So I ironed on all the ultra suede onto the backing. This is what it looked like when it was all ironed on the floor. What I learned is that because the backing is made of a polyester fabric, because I wanted it to be durable and washable, the Wonder Under doesn't stick to it that well. It's good, but it's not good enough. So I had to then glue it all from the back. It went through the sheer fabric. The glue would go through the sheer fabric and stay. And I use, in all of my work, I use this one brand of glue. I think it's wonderful, and you don't need a lot of it, and it really is permanent. But I don't rely on gluing fabric. I would never just glue fabric. I always sew it. So after everything is dried, make sure it's all dried before you take anything to your sewing machine. Then I free motion sew all the paper cutting to the fabric. Again, the glue is good for temporary, but it's not going to hold up for generations, which is my hope, that this will be used for generations. So that's how I make a paper cut huppah like this one. And it is a lot of work, but I think it's going to get a lot of joy in a lot of weddings, I hope. Now let me talk about the poles in a huppah for a minute. You can use any kind of poles you want, PVC, wood, or birch. Birch is really nice, and you probably have noticed in some of the photographs that a lot of these huppah poles are made of birch. You can buy them on Etsy now, and if you don't have somebody local who can make them for you. But it's beautiful to use birch. It just adds a lot of beauty and nature to a wedding. At the top of the pole, I like to put what's called a safety cup hook. A cup hook has the rounded top, but the safety adds a little bit of safety when you're attaching a ribbon and the wind might come. So I like these at the top of the poles. And on the corners of the huppah, I either sew ribbon or I sew a plastic ring. And if it's a large huppah, larger than like 6 feet, I will do not just 4, not just on each corner, but I will do 8, one in the center of each side, because I think in a very large huppah, you're going to want to anchor more than just the 4 corners if you have a large frame. So it's something to think about when you're doing the corners of a huppah. Now, when I started making the paper cut huppot, people asked me for the price, and they are quite expensive because you can see how much labor they take. So I wanted to come up with a less expensive option, and that's when I started getting into using a company that I absolutely adore called Spoonflower. So what I want to talk about how you can use Spoonflower to make a huppah. And there are many other ways to make a huppah, but I'm going to just concentrate on this as the last little piece about how you make a huppah. So this example here of this beautiful couple, they wanted a paper cut style huppah, but not the expense of a handmade one. So this is an example of a printed paper cut huppah. So what I do is I take whatever design I'm going to be printing, in this case, a version of that paper cut design. And I use in Photoshop, I set it to the size that I am going to be printing. So if the huppah is going to be 50 by 50 inches, it will be set up in Photoshop at 50 by 50 inches. There are technical things you need to know about setting up printing on the computer. One is that you need to print at 150 DPI. It's a simple thing, but it will help you a lot to remember that, 150 DPI. So I set it up to the size it's going to print, and then I upload it to Spoonflower. And you, very, very simple. On the right, you pick the fabric you're going to be printing on. So here you will see, oh, I just wanted to show you 52 by 52 inches, 150 DPI, pixels per inch. Then I choose the fabric. Each fabric has a different size. Some are 52 inches. There's two that are 116 inches wide. Most are around 50 inches wide. So since a huppah is usually larger than 36 inches, which is 1 yard, you almost always have to order 2 yards, which is up to 72 inches. So that's why I order 2 yards, which at 52 inches wide, which gives me 52 by 72. So you have some extra fabric, and that's why you saw before the extra. That's just because the fabric comes 72 inches long, 52 inches wide. This is how you set up anything you're going to print on Spoonflower. Once you've decided the fabric and the size, in this case I'm ordering 2 yards, then you just add it to your cart and order it. It's a fantastic way of using photographs to put onto a huppah that you're going to make using applique. It's a great way if you want to make a family tree huppah. So this is an example of a family tree design that I offer, and then I can fill in the names of the family on the leaves or on the trunk or on the branches or roots of the tree. Anyone in your family who's an artist who does watercolor, you can take a photo of that painting and you can upload it to Spoonflower, and it can become your huppah. I just think it's an amazing opportunity that we have with this kind of a company. They have fabrics like charmeuse, which is more translucent, and then they have cotton, which you could make into a bed quilt after the wedding. So lots and lots of options of fabrics, and it's really not very expensive either. So I'm telling you my most important secret, and that's Spoonflower. I love it. Here's an example: a watercolor painting with the quotation, "I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine," printed on a charmeuse fabric. It's a poly charmeuse, not a silk. So it is in theory washable, and then bordered with extra fabric to make it a little bit larger. So it's a great way to make a huppah that's personalized, artistic, and not hugely expensive. So, and this is a final picture I just want to show you. So you can take that Spoonflower fabric, add a border of about 12 inches of organza, and then you have a much larger huppah. Or you can print it on cotton and go up to 116 inches wide on your huppah. So the options are limitless. I hope I've given you a lot of ideas and stirred a lot of creative energy in everybody on how to make a huppah for a wedding in your family. And now I just want to open it up if there are any questions. And let me just stop sharing for a second. There we go. Okay. So
there were a bunch of questions as we went along, and if you already addressed them, you can just say so and skip them, of course, but I'll go in order. How's that sound?
Thank you. Yes, that's great.
Okay, great. How do you secure the poles if no one is holding them?
So there are many ideas online. I've seen people fill buckets with sand if it's an outdoor wedding, and then disguise the buckets with flowers. A lot of florists have stands that they rent out as part of their packages. So I would always ask your florist if you're using a florist. And then of course synagogues, most big synagogues have a huppah frame or a huppah stand that they use for weddings. So they have things that they've already made for that purpose.
Have you seen huppot with wimples added?
I have, and I've actually designed wimples for people to use for chuppah. A wimple is an old Eastern European piece of needlework that would be made at a baby's birth, and then used at significant moments throughout their lives. So it could be needle pointed, it could be embroidered, cross stitched, and then it could be incorporated into a chuppah. So yes, it's a great idea.
Do you use a long arm quilting machine for the large pieces of fabric?
I do sometimes. I have a long arm quilting machine, which I of course love. Really depends on how large. I find that setting up the long arm quilting machine takes a long time. So sometimes if it's 50 inches or so, I'll just use my regular sewing machine and free motion quilt it. But if it's larger than 50, I go to the long arm. It really kind of depends. When I make a very large art curtain, I do use the long arm quilting machine. It's all about, for me, it's all about size.
And do you need a special machine to steam?
The answer is no. You can make your own steamer by using, well, I've made my own sometimes. You use a big pot on the stove, the biggest pot you can find. I think a lobster pot is what they're called when they're really, really big. And as long as you can protect the fabric from getting a drop of water on it, not one drop of water can get on that fabric, then you can steam. And there are instructions online on how to do that. I'm such a klutz, and I do steam a lot of fabric, that I bought that steamer 30 years ago, and it's been one of the most important investments I ever made. So if you're not going to be doing a ton of steaming, try doing it on your stove. It has to steam a long time, but there are lots of YouTube videos on how to make a steamer on your stove. Highly recommend it. If you're nervous about that, there are lots of fabric paints that don't require steaming. I use a lot of different kinds of fabric paints. I love to paint on cotton. Doesn't require anything. It's super easy. So if you're at all nervous about that, go toward a different technique.
And do you generally display the chuppah after the ceremony so that people can see the work up close?
I haven't seen that done. I've had, when there's a beautiful chuppah, I've seen people kind of rush toward the chuppah after the ceremony and look at it in place. But I haven't seen it taken off the canopy and hung upright at the reception, but there's no reason you can't do that. I mean, I've seen that done many times with the ketubah, but moving a chuppah can be a bigger deal, unless it's just the kind that are just held with the 4 people holding it during the ceremony.
And along those lines, how do you frame the chuppah afterwards? Most are too big to hang.
So all the chuppot that I make, I include a rod pocket at the top. And you just have to purchase a rod like at Bed Bath & Beyond and hang it up. And they're not framed. They are hung on a wall like you would hang a quilt. If you wanted to frame, of course you can purchase a plexiglass frame through a framer, but I don't think if they're that necessary if you keep them away from light. The most detrimental thing to fabric is light. Don't worry about dust, really isn't a big deal in most people's homes. It's light. So if you just hang it on a rod and it's not in any direct light, you're going to be fine. Wait, Julie, you're on mute. Sorry.
I've gotten the hang of this by now. How do you paper cut on ultra suede?
Okay. So as I explained, you iron on the wonder under, and then you cut through the wonder under and the fabric. After you've cut out all those shapes, you have a fabric with a paper backing, and you peel away the paper backing and you iron on the fabric onto whatever your backing is. The wonder under makes any fabric into an applique iron-on fabric. That's the beauty of wonder under, or any fusible web as they're called, fusible web.
Okay, I think that answered the next question, which is what is the fabric the paper cut ultra suede is attached to?
So I use ultra suede as the main fabric, and then for the backing, they're usually a polyester translucent fabric, like a sheer poly organza is what they would be called. As I said, the Wonder Under doesn't stick to it very well, and that's why I have to use glue and then I sew. Wonder Under is great for temporary hold, but don't rely on it for permanent hold.
And then there are two related questions. What do you use to print out the Hebrew in order to trace it? And someone else asked, where can they order Hebrew and English lettering for a chuppah that is already created?
Well, I use Illustrator for everything. So, and I've made my own fonts. So I take those fonts I designed years ago and I make them in Illustrator, and that's how I do it. You can go online. There are lots of free websites where you can download Hebrew fonts. And just Google that, free Hebrew fonts, and there's an amazing number of fonts that are available for free. And then it's all about playing with simple programs on your computer. I think most computers come with some kind of Photoshop elements or program like that. So use a Xerox machine, use your simplest program you have, and play around with enlarging letters. It's really that simple. And then I trace everything. I see somebody had a question about how I get the tracing onto the silk. You can see through silk. So I put the Xerox on the table, lay the silk on top of it, and then trace it either with a pencil or a disappearing pen, one of those two.
Are there any lace knitting options available?
Oh, well, as a knitter, I think it'd be so cool to knit a chuppah. I'm sure people have done it. I think you could do a gorgeous chuppah using a lace knitting technique. Same with crochet. And some of the most beautiful chuppot I've seen are taking lace fabric and just doing something beautiful with it. Or, as I pointed out, old lace wedding dresses. Beautiful.
And Michelle, you had a question. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
I'm a knitter, and I really wanted to knit for my grandchildren. We used my temple's talit for my son's wedding, and for my grandsons who are still very young. So hopefully at 70, I can get it done by the time they get ready to be married. But are there any actual patterns to follow for lace knitting? And it would be pure lace knitting. It wouldn't be piecing. I would just totally relace it,
The beautiful thing about a chuppah is there's no specific thing you have to do. So other than I would suggest knitting in a square, knitting a square, maybe 50 by 50 inches, aiming for that, finding a gauge that will work for you for that. As a knitter, that's what I would aim for. As to design in it, I don't know where you can find that kind of pattern, but I would look for a pattern for how to do a flower and then place 4 flowers on your chuppah and start knitting. You could go crazy with it, and you've given me a great idea because I love knitting so much. So good luck. It's a great idea. Great idea.
Do you ever use rattan to keep the paint from fading?
No, I don't know what that is. But no, as I said, I steam the silk, and that in theory should keep it from fading. I mean, the ones I've been making are now 30 something years old, and I haven't heard complaints, but keep it away from the sun.
Right, if we take anything away, keep it away from the light.
All fabric, all fabric.
Yeah. Any other questions before we close up for today? Have you ever used Spoonflower to make the base of a talit as you've done with Huppah?
I've used Spoonflower for everything. I love that company. And of course, when I found out that I'm such a nerd about Spoonflower, but I watched their company, where they get their machines from. They get them made in Israel. That was like the coolest thing, that Israel invented this technology that they use. But the customer service is great. The fabrics are top quality, and I love them. You would think I own stock in them, but I don't.
And one more question from B. Maya.
Thank you. I was wondering, I wasn't sure if I heard any mention of any huppahs being made for same-sex couples, and I was wondering, are there any, I know you said there's not rules specifically, but if there's any differences to the things that they would have made.
The answer is I've made several for 2 men and 2 women getting married, and the answer is no. There is no difference. It's whatever speaks to the couple. It's all about, I think it's just all about the couple getting married, what their tastes are, what their interests are. Do they want to use it for another purpose after the wedding? No, nothing specific comes to mind. With every couple getting married, just if you're the artist, you want to make it for them and talk about what they're going to think about after, with this huppah. How are they going to use it after? How is it going to be meaningful to them? Yeah, somebody's pointing out that the quotations can be sex specific. So you want to make sure that the quotations are appropriate for whoever you're using, making the huppah for. So check on the wording of the quotations. Is it speaking in the male plural or the female plural? That kind of thing with the Hebrew. And somebody pointed out Ravelry. Again, another site that I love. Ravelry might have some ideas for huppot on it. So look that up. That's a great idea. They have everything else having to do with knitting. Yeah, so that's wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, one more question from Annette. Annette, go ahead and unmute yourself.
No, I never had a question. Thank you, but I enjoyed the session tremendously.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Pam?
Somebody pointed out that Spoonflower is based also in Germany. So if you are looking to order for Israel or anywhere in Europe, they do ship there.
We have just redone our sanctuary, and a huppah is in the plan. And where do you get the structure? And how do I go about getting that for our use?
So I think a local carpenter is the best place to start, because you don't want to be shipping wood all over. It's better to start with a carpenter and just give the carpenter a drawing of what you would like, and look all over the internet at huppah structures. Google huppah poles, huppah structures, permanent huppah structures. Our synagogue has one that comes apart with bolts. So the legs are freestanding. I mean, the poles are freestanding, has stuff at the bottom to keep it up. And then the whole thing can be put together fairly simply. And also I recommend going a little bit bigger than you would for one family. One family might say, well, a 5 by 5 foot huppah would be good for us, but think about what all families would like and go a little bit bigger, because it never hurts to be a little bit too big as a synagogue huppah. Where families don't have that option sometimes. So I would do that. And also, when I make a synagogue huppah, we make it very generic in terms of the colors, white on white, or keeping it fairly neutral, because you don't know what the bride or groom or brides and grooms might want for their particular wedding. So keep it neutral. Don't go crazy with colors and stuff.